One day, 3-year-old Dorothy was playing by herself at home when she fell down the stairs onto a stake and lost consciousness as a result of the blow to her head. When her family found the little girl, she had stopped breathing. The family urgently calls a doctor, but unfortunately, it's too late. The little girl has lost her life. Devastated by the news from the doctor, the family lays their little child's body in bed, and the doctor leaves the house to fetch the death certificate. About an hour later, the doctor and his team arrive at the house with the documents and re-enter the room with the family to collect the little girl's body, only to be met with a sight that shocks them all. The little girl is playing with her toys as if nothing had happened. The doctor examines Dorothy again and again. No injury, no permanent damage. The little girl is alive and well. The doctor states with astonishment that this is officially a case of coming back from the dead. However, there is one point where the doctor is mistaken. It is not Dorothy who returns from death, but someone else. Dorothy Eady was born in London in 1904. Until the day he fell down the stairs and died, only to miraculously come back to life, he was a perfectly normal little boy. But after the incident that day, her family observes major changes in Dorothy. The little girl has started having nightmares every night. She tells her mother that in her dreams she sees herself in a building with gardens and pools between large columns. For months afterward, Dorothy kept having the same dream and would wake up in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, crying that she wanted to go home. Even if her family tried to reassure her that this was her home, over time this would cause the little girl to become depressed. When her family asked her where the house she wanted to go to was, the little girl cried and said she didn't know. After her resurrection, Dorothy's accent also began to change, gradually transforming into a heavier and more pronounced form of English. This situation has become so disturbing that it has even prevented the family from finding a babysitter for their young daughters. When the little girl was 4 years old, her family took Dorothy with them to the British Museum one day, and things started to get strange from that moment on. Like many of her peers, the little girl who was quite bored in the museum is enchanted and filled with joy when she comes to the museum's ancient Egyptian section. When he sees the pharaoh statues from ancient Egypt, an extraordinary event occurs. The little girl, transfixed by the statues, lets go of her mother's hand, takes off her shoes, and begins kissing the statue's feet. At that moment, he shouts at those passing by the statues, "How dare you walk in shoes in the presence of the gods?" Her mother is utterly horrified by her daughter's behavior. But suddenly, Dorothy's excited movements stop. Sadness has covered the little girl's face. When her family goes to see her, they see her looking with old eyes at a mummy lying in a glass coffin. When her mother tries to pull the little girl toward her, Dorothy does not take her mother's hand. Looking at the mummy inside the glass case, he says in a heavy Middle Eastern accent, unexpected for his age, "These are my people." After that day, the family took their little girl to the museum whenever they had the chance, because this is the only place where Dorothy's face smiles and she is happy. When Dorothy turned 7, her father bought her a corn encyclopedia written for children. The little girl's only interest has been the encyclopedia. She spends hours examining the photographs and pictures inside it with a magnifying glass, especially the hieroglyphic writings. When her curious mother asks her what she is doing, little Dorothy replies, "I'm trying to remember." The family buys all magazines with similar content for their daughter's happiness. In one of these history magazines, Dorothy comes across an image of the Temple of Seti in the city of Abydos. The little girl goes to her mother, looking surprised and confused, shows her the temple, and asks where all the trees, pools, and flowers are. Her stunned mother asks, "Where is this, my dear?" Dorothy gives her mother this answer, with a big smile on her face. "This is my home." Throughout history, there have been many stories of children who remembered their past lives. However, children generally lose these memories by the age of 5 or 6. But in the case of Dorothy Eady, events took a completely opposite course. As the little girl grew older, her memories became clearer, until the day she finally remembered exactly who she was and when she had lived. 3,000 years ago. Dorothy spoke quite openly about reincarnation in every setting throughout her life. However, while this interesting lifestyle was accepted by her family when she was a young girl in the 1920s, it was not very well received by English society. Once, the rabbi of the church where the family went for sermons came to the Eadler family's house and said that their daughters were no longer welcome at the church. When the family asked why, he explained that their daughters didn't sing the hymns describing the Egyptian oppression in the Bible and did not worship Jesus, and that he had told them that this religion was a false religion derived from ancient Egyptian beliefs. Dorothy spends so much of her time at the British Museum that one day the Egyptologist at the museum, Sir Wallace Batch, begins to teach the young girl to read and write hieroglyphics. According to Wallace Batch, Dorothy's mastery of this ancient language was astonishingly rapid. Dorothy's dreams never ceased, but the young girl no longer feared them because she had begun to understand what was happening. When Dorothy turned 15, she began waking up frequently during the night. She recounts hearing the voice of a being named Hora, who demanded that the young girl write down everything he told her. This went on for a full year. Dorothy would wake up in the middle of the night in a semi-trance state, completely under the control of her subconscious, and write down everything the voice told her in both English and Egyptian. By the end of the year, she had written a 70-page book, and even more astonishingly, the handwriting in the notes written by the young girl in her trance was completely different from her normal handwriting. When Dorothy completes the 70-page book, she realizes that the story she has written is the story of her own life. She has written, line by line, the life she lived 3,000 years ago. Dorothy's life in Egypt was as follows. She was a woman who lived 3,000 years ago, born in the city of Abydos, named Bentrestia. Her father was a soldier in the army during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her mother grew and sold vegetables. When Bentrestia was 2 years old, her mother died, and her father, unable to provide for her, sent her to become a temple priestess. When she turned 12, the temple where she was educated offered her 2 choices. Either she would be abandoned to the temple to live out her life alone, or she would dedicate herself to the gods as a sacred temple maiden. She chooses to remain in Bentrestia as a temple priestess and takes her vows of devotion. However, a few years later, she has an illicit affair with the pharaoh of the time, Seti I, and becomes pregnant. Upon learning of the situation, the high priest of the temple declared that Bentrestia had broken her sacred vow and committed one of the greatest sins for which she would be punished by death. To prevent the situation from escalating and tarnishing the pharaoh's reputation, the young priest took her own life one evening and closed her eyes to life. Dorothy now clearly remembers her entire past, and, as a twist of fate, shortly after her memory fully returns, she finds a job in the Egyptian Public Relations magazine published in London. Sometime later, through her job at the magazine, she meets and marries an Egyptian businessman named Iman Abdel Megout and gets the chance to visit Egypt, the country she calls her true homeland for the first time in her life. More importantly, she also gets the opportunity to prove to the whole world that she is truly the reincarnation of an Egyptian priestess. Dorothy's marriage did not last long because, even though she was English and her husband and his family were Egyptian, Dorothy was much more deeply attached to Egyptian customs than her husband and his family, and after a while, as you can imagine, arguments with her Muslim family began to heat up, and the marriage ended. However, during this time, Dorothy, who had one son, named her child after Seti, the pharaoh she had loved thousands of years ago. She also changed her own name